Welcome to my first code roast and my first video of 2024. December was kind of quiet as I was busy with some client work, but I'm back in the saddle again, and I'm coming to you with a live code roast. Well, it's not live. It's live as I record it. It's not live as you're watching it. Let's get started. This project comes from one of my YouTube subscribers, I hope I said that right. Thank you for submitting this for review. It's an open source project, so it's public. It's not some personal hobby project, I guess. We'll see what it looks like. And let's get started and see how this code looks and what I would change or what I would critique about it. So the project is on github.com/Fulton/ChessImager. I don't know what that means. What is a ChessImager? I hope we'll find out together. I'm going to go ahead and clone this locally. And while that's happening, we'll get started looking through some of the files here. As you know, if you've watched these videos before, I usually start with the go.mod file, because that's a nice way to get a high-level overview of the project. First things first, great import path. It uses the proper import path. I've talked about that in previous videos. I'll have some links if you're interested in what I mean. This project targets Go 1.21, the latest as of this recording, although that won't be true for long. 1.22 is scheduled for release in February. And it has a fairly short import list. I like that. Of course, there are times when long import lists are appropriate, but especially for an open source project, especially a library, it's nice to have short lists because you don't have to have a lot of import dependencies that you're pulling in when you use it. We have, I don't know most of these. I'm not an image or graphics programmer really. I've tinkered with it in a few cases, but I don't know most of these libraries. I know this one because it's from the semi-standard library, the golang.org/x image. That's where you get the standard TIFF and GIF and JPEG and so on libraries. I don't know Fogelman GG. Free type is fonts apparently. I think I've seen this library before. It's for resizing images. And another free type. So a couple of things related to font and other image stuff that I don't know what that is. And there's indirect one. I'm not exactly sure what that is either, but I care less about indirect dependencies. So we're doing some graphics stuff, so true to the name Imager. Yeah, can't really tell beyond that what's happening here, but I like the go.mod file. It's nice and short, so that's nice. Let's look at the README here. Well, this is fairly in-depth, I would say. It's a long README, so that's good. I'm not going to read it all on this video, but that's good for an open source project because the README is the first line of defense when it comes to documentation. Let's see what it does here. ChessImager is a Go package that creates images of chessboards based on a Fen string. I don't know that acronym, but I think I played chess long ago when I was a preteen. I'm pretty sure this is where it says like it's a notation. I think. Let's see if we can find an example of what the chessboard layout looks like. I don't see it. An example here. Okay, let's do this the hard way. Forsyth Edwards notation. Just want an example. I don't see the long detailed explanation. I guess this is it here. Just zoom in, it's hard to see. So RN, B, Q, blah, 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 blah. I'm guessing uppercase is in lowercase, loose, black and white. Maybe I'm not familiar with this notation, but anyway, that's kind of cool. That's what we're taking. Strings like that to turn them into a graphic like this, I guess. It is highly configurable, so you can create chessboard images that look exactly the way you want them to look. Awesome. Here's an example. All the examples will come from move 25 by Kasparov playing against Topalov, okay, in the Netherlands. Okay, so here's an example of the string. And I don't know what this additional notation means. I guess I don't care either, but I'm sure it's useful for someone. And then it creates a PNG of it. So that's kind of cool. Let's look at the code. Let's look at the directory structure. We have a config directory, examples, test. Here's what test is. So the unit tests, I'm calling them unit tests without looking at them. The tests are in a separate directory. That's a bit unusual for a Go project, but there are times when that makes sense. I might look at that more closely a little bit later. Typically, your test files live next to the files they're testing. but that's not always appropriate. So no negative marks, at least not yet. Examples, I like that. This is usually going to be executable examples or maybe partial examples. So here, yeah, it's a main program that just shows me things. But I like that. It's kind of a collection of random stuff, not part of the main package or part of the main distribution or whatever. Putting that in an examples directory makes good sense. And then config. Let's see what this is. This is just configuration, so it's not actually Go. It's not a config package. It's just a configuration file. So that's fine too. So it looks like everything is in the main package. Those are the only subdirectories: config, examples, and test. Everything else is in the main package. That makes review easy. I'm not sure how big this main package is. Before I dive into that, I think my download is completed. Let's see. I'm going to run cover, but that's going to tell me 0% probably, because the tests are in a different package than the code it's testing. Download some dependencies. So we have 2.3% coverage, and then we have a failure to load. Okay, so here's my first complaint. It looks like the tests are hard-coded to the developer's directory structure. It's trying to open something in home per code ChessImager blah blah, which obviously doesn't exist on my system. So there's a problem. That's something to fix. We're gonna find that. And oh yeah, that's so in the examples I don't care. That's fine. The configuration file looks like is where that is configured, and the tests also yeah. So fix that. I don't know the exact solution. Probably use a relative path. Would be the solution to this. At least in your test, you might want to have your test use dot slash something or dot dot slash whatever to get to the correct config file. But that would be my first complaint, is that your default configuration and your tests are hard-coded to your machine, which makes it difficult for me as a contributor. I can't even run the test to see if my pull request is working. And as a consumer of this, if I were interested in doing this, I would have to do a bunch of hacking or figure out what's wrong to make it work. Maybe that's covered in the documentation. So the documentation claims that you can use the embedded config default JSON. I don't know if it actually means embedded or just included, but either way, it's wrong because it won't work unless I have the same directory structure, apparently. Yeah. So that's something to fix from a usability standpoint as well as from a contributor standpoint. So I can't actually run the test locally to see what kind of coverage we have, but we'll put that aside. I'm assuming that there's some good test coverage because there's a lot of tests in the directory. Let's look at the code. Pull it up in my IDE. It's a little bit easier to bounce around that way. There's no main.go. Okay, so this is the library only. Okay, so that makes some sense. There is no, it's not a main package. Okay, that's fine. So what I'm going to do then, rather than running it locally, since that's not an option, or it might be if I set up an example, but I'm just going to review it. So one thing I would like to see is, since this is the library, I would like to see a link to the Go doc here. That's just a nice convention. I mean, I can get to it anyway, but it's nice to have a link at the top of your project. I use those all the time when I'm browsing it. So it's a nice usability improvement. So there's a Go doc. Let me zoom in a little bit. So since this is library, I'm interested in seeing what the library looks like, the API, what the entry point is, and stuff like that. So we have a bunch of different types defined, a board, etc. Context. And I have a problem with the word context. And this includes in the standard library. It doesn't mean much, right? Its meaning depends on context. So it's hard to know exactly what this means. And in the standard library, we have this package called context that gives you a context.context. But it's more like a bundle of timeouts and values. I don't know what better name to give it, but lots of libraries, and I'm guilty of this. I've created libraries that use the idea of a context. Kind of just a bundle of stuff. It doesn't really tell you much. So if you're going to use that, at minimum, give it some good documentation. So explain what this is. So I would add some Go doc to this. Many of these functions do have Go doc. That's good. add move, adds a move. That's pretty obvious, but I'm glad that you put the Go doc there just to make it obvious. But the context is missing Go doc. It doesn't really tell me what that is. It may be obvious to somebody who knows this FAN or FEN notation, or who's a chess player. Maybe it's obvious. It's not obvious based on my old 12-year-old knowledge of chess exactly what this means. So I would add some documentation for that. Overall, the documentation looks pretty good, though. I haven't read it word for word, but I can see that there's some good documentation explaining what different values mean and so on. So overall, the documentation looks good. I'm just missing it on that context thing. But let's continue. Okay, imager. This looks like maybe a good entry point. New imager creates a new imager. And then from path, creates an imager using user-defined JSON file. Okay? So these look like an entry point. So let's look at this imager type, see what kind of stuff it has. So we can fit into context. Does this explain it? So I think this Go doc is broken. I think this is supposed to be a bulleted list. It's pretty easy to fix. Just look up how to write Go doc, the syntax it uses, and you can fix that. But I think this is supposed to be a bulleted list. You can use it to add highlighted squares, notations, and moves. And then here's how you render the thing. Okay. Let's get back to the code. Let me find what file this image is in. So one small complaint I have is the camel case in the package name. That's not conventional really in Go. Probably the convention would be this, just all lowercase. However, since this is a public package, I would not change it now. Changing it now will confuse people. It will break import paths. So don't change it. But if you're watching this and you're thinking of creating a public open source project in the future, convention is all lowercase in your package name. So it's not a big deal, but that's the Go way. Alrighty, let's look at the code here. Okay, so when it said that the config file was embedded, it was not lying. It actually is embedded, which kind of makes the hard-coded paths even worse. Fix that, please. Because that means you're shipping binaries that have somebody else, that have your personal path structure embedded in them. It's completely worthless to everybody else. So fix that. Let's see. Imager needs a comment to explain what it is. As a rule, I think it's really good to put Go.comments on every exported symbol in your package and some of the unexported ones, anything that's confusing. That's especially important for a public library like this. So there are linters that will let you do that. Speaking of linters, let me see if there's any linter configured here. I don't see one. I would encourage setting up a linter on any project, honestly. But in particular, as I'm talking about this topic, you could set up Golang CI lint to tell you if you have exported package, either variables or constants or functions types that don't have Go.comment on them, so it'll remind you to do that. So that would be a nice thing to do for a public project like this. We have a couple of global variables. I don't like that, but maybe there's a good reason. So here we have use internal font. It's commented. Used to circumvent a bug. Okay, I guess I have to look at this, understand what that is for. Okay, this I don't like this. No, this is broken. I haven't looked obviously far. I'm only in the first file. But what I see happening here is we have this settings global variable that is being set by this constructor. That is what I would call a code lie. When I call a constructor, I expect it to return a constructed object, not a constructed object that also references global state, which is what's happening here. So there's two problems here, and they're both fairly serious. The first is that I cannot have two simultaneous instances of imager created that refer to different settings. If I call new imager from path, yeah, this is really bad. Okay, so if I call new imager from path with my custom configuration, and I have that running, say in a web service, for example, maybe I have a website that serves these chess images, and I call new imager from path, and I pass it some configuration, and then a moment later, or hours later, or whatever, I do the same thing again with a different configuration. That first instance now is referencing the new configuration because that configuration is stored globally, not in the instance. That's the first big problem. So this is broken. the API effectively lies to the user because it implicitly suggests that this imager contains the configuration that was stored here, but it doesn't. So that's what I would call an API lie or a code lie. Fix that, please. The second problem is you have a data race here. If I say call this new imager from path, or even new imager, if I suppose I call that on every HTTP request, sooner or later my server will crash due to a data race, because one of my requests will be setting this while another one is reading it, and that's a data race. So to solve that, you either need to put a mutex around this or some other atomicity, or better, just move this settings thing into the struct, and then it won't lie. Now, I don't know what implications that has elsewhere in the code. It may require a major refactor, or it might be super simple. I don't know. But that's broken. That needs to be fixed. At the very, very minimum, the quickest solution to this, like for your next point release that you do in 5 minutes after watching this video, is to add some documentation here. Something like that. And add the same comment to new imager from path. At the very minimum, do that so that anybody using your code knows that it's not thread safe and can avoid the foot guns I just mentioned, and then fix the code to be correct. So that's the first big thing. What else can we talk about here? I don't like the naked returns, and you're only using it one place right here. Just be explicit. Actually, icon and nil. Just do that. And then get rid of these named returns here. Named returns are useful in some cases. Because settings as a global variable, I can't use the colon here because it creates a new scope and it's unused. So this is more readable. It's not a big deal in this case. It's a short function. And the only place where the implicit returns were used was the last line. But the problem with the naked returns, which I've talked about in other videos, I'll put links, is that it's not obvious. Like when I look at this code in isolation, it's confusing. Like I have to go up here and read to see what it's actually returning. I can't tell if it's returning nothing or if it's returning something implicitly. So don't use naked returns. That's another place where a linter can help you. Golang CI lint has a couple different linters that will tell you about naked returns, so you can clean those up. Let's move on. I'm not sure why this error is defined here. It's completely unnecessary. Let's talk about what it does and then why it's not necessary. So first off, I don't like it because it's dangling. Like it's not obvious why it's here because I don't use it immediately next. So the very first thing you can do to improve this is move all your variable declarations to the first place they're used. This might I'm working on a code base for one of my clients right now that was written by some PHP developers in Go. And in PHP, it's convention, if not required, to put all your variable declarations at the top of each function. So they do that in Go, and it looks ridiculous, and it's hard to read. So don't do that in Go. Maybe that's why this is done. Maybe the author is a PHP developer in a former life or something. I don't know. But just move this to the first place it's used. And the easy way to do that, if you're using VS Code or Golang or something, is it'll tell you, just delete it, and it will tell you where it's failing. Now, in this case, it's not failing, which is to my next point, because it's not actually needed. But the first place it's used is right here on line 66. So I would just move this, assuming it's needed, down here to line 66. Now the code is more readable because I don't have this var error up there that doesn't reference anything immediately. Now when I get to that var error, I can see, oh, it's used on the next line. Which gets me to the second point that it's not needed at all because we have this colon equals, which assigns or creates any uncreated variables for us automatically. So that's exactly equivalent. So just get rid of that. Makes your code a little more readable. Not a big deal, but readability is nice. Let's see what else we're doing here. So renders an image of a chessboard based on Fen string and context. So first we validate that the Fen string is valid, I guess. And if it's not, it returns an error. Okay. And then we set. So this is here's a little bit of an API smell. I wouldn't. I don't want to be too strong about this. I don't like it, but it's not uncommon. So the function name or the method name render. I don't know what ex means, but I guess render ex takes a context and render doesn't. I would make that ex more clear if possible. I'm taking a side note here. Maybe call it render with context or render context. I don't know. Again, context isn't clear either. So if you can think of a way to make that more clear, I would suggest doing that. with the caveat that that will break your public API. And since this is a public project, you might not want to do that. Or if you do, let me talk about that. And I'll get back to the point I was going to make. If you choose to change this, leave the old. So here's what I would do. Let's say we decide to call this render context, just for argument's sake, right? All right, now it's clear, and now everybody knows what it means, blah blah blah. But now anybody using the old version of the API is broken. So to prevent that, we need to keep the render X thing there, so that old users of the old library don't break when they upgrade. So the solution there is to leave a stub in place with the old name, but document that it uses the new name, and then add this magical comment. The last line to be deprecated : and then a description. And the Go tooling and Golang CI-lint and other tools will recognize this deprecated : and will mark uses of this as deprecated. VS Code and I think Golang will render it with a strike through in your IDE. So if you're browsing code that uses deprecated functions, for example, it will just indicate that for you visually. So if you choose to rename this to be more clear, make sure you leave the old version in place with this deprecated comment. All right, I'm going to undo all that. That was a little side tangent about naming. That's not really the point I was trying to make in the first place. The point I wanted to make is that this name, render, suggests that it produces output, which it does, but it does not suggest that it mutates the imager, or the I instance of imager, which it also does. You can see here where we set i.fen and i.ctx to these inputs, which, like I said, is not a huge complaint. I don't like it. I prefer to keep my getters and setters, if you will, completely separate. So my preference would be to set these in a different method where it's obvious that what I'm doing is setting something. So we could do something like func imager set context and func. If we did this, for example, then render wouldn't have to take any arguments, and render ex wouldn't need to exist. We could just have render that all it does is render. So that's something to consider. Not a big thing, but it makes the API a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier to reason about. So it's sort of a nice to have. Let's keep going. New context returns to new context. Here we have set order. So we already have precedent for setters. This violates what I was talking about earlier, though. This doesn't actually set order on I. In fact, I could delete I there entirely. It sets order on the global settings, which is a problem for all the reasons I already described. Get renderers. What is this here? I'm not sure what these renderers are. This isn't exported, so but it's a getter, and the function signature suggests that it's getting renderers from I, but it's not actually. Well, let me see what these are. So it's instantiating 7 renderers and passing I to those. So making it a method on I is appropriate. I'm not sure why it's passing it. Like, this doesn't need it doesn't reference it anywhere. So you could simplify that. Maybe some of them do, but that one certainly doesn't. That one doesn't either. Oh, it needs a method render context. Okay. So it does indirectly use some of those. Okay, let me undo that. I'm not sure exactly how this is used. I'm guessing that whatever. Let's see how this is used, and then I'll know. So here we get a list of renderers, and then we range over them. We call draw on each one. Okay. So what I was wondering is if we only use one or the other. But I see one is for the border, one is the border. Okay, that makes sense. So my thought process was maybe you only use one. Like I thought maybe one was for JPEGs and one was for PNGs and one was for whatever. And you only use one or the other, and in which case I was going to suggest only instantiate the one you need. But these are different passes of rendering, so it does make sense that you want to instantiate them all. All right. There's the order, so you can, I guess that's for layering purposes, perhaps. You can have certain things run above or below others, maybe. And the board size, you change the rectangle with the size of the board plus the border surrounding it. Okay. Load settings, open the path. This need to be in JSON format. Good. It's going to be simplified, by the way. Not a big deal, but if you care, if you like to simplify your code, I like to simplify my code, so that would be one way to do that. Don't like to panic. Okay, the comment explains, and I suppose that's alright, yeah. The embedded settings should always be correct. Fair enough. Validate settings. This is just validate settings, it also actually like loads files to see that they exist, I guess. I have mixed feelings about that. I have no problem with, and in fact I encourage a function to validate your configuration. That that it's valid, that it looks like it has, integers aren't out of range, that things look like URLs, etc. I have a small problem with actually opening files to see that they exist as part of the configuration validation. But two reasons for that. I'll talk about both. The first is in this case, we're opening a file, reading it, and decoding an image, and then just discarding that. I suppose that, so it does a couple different validations. It validates the file exists and that it contains an image of the correct format. So, maybe that's useful. But that doesn't feel like configuration validation to me. That feels like a different level of validation. So I'm not a big fan of doing that as part of the configuration validation. Second, I feel like it's probably redundant. Like, no doubt we have to load that file and parse it and actually use the result later. So, and there's the two problems. The one problem is it's mixing concerns. Validating of settings versus validating of image file formats seems like two separate concerns to me. Perhaps the bigger problem is that we're doing redundant work. So in this case, we open every one of these files, board type image, places type image map, etc. Open all these things and parse them and discard the value. And then presumably later, we open the same file again and do the parsing again and use the result. Why don't we just wait till that second time? And if there's an error, report it at that moment. There's probably no difference from the user perspective if they get that error later, a few microseconds later versus now. And it'll make your code simpler and less redundant. So that's my first thing. It mixes concerns and it's probably unnecessarily redundant. Further, if any of these file types are not actually used during the run due to, say, configuration that says there's no border or whatever, then you're actually needlessly reading this file that you don't even need at all. So I would consider changing that. Let's see what else I can find here. So this just opens the file to see if it exists, basically. Yeah, okay. I probably wouldn't do that until I actually need to read the file also. I mean, just opening a file is fairly cheap, but it's not free. For a command line tool, probably not a big deal. If this is a server serving millions of requests a day or something, that could be a lot of extra disk activity for no reason. So, given that this is a library, and you don't know how it'll be used, I mean, I doubt that anybody's going to be using this library and a server that's handling millions of requests per day, given the niche nature of this library, but still, good engineering practice would be to not do unnecessary file opens. Now, having said that, supposing we're engineering this for millions of requests per day, probably what you want to do, so I'm imagining that the reason to do this validation when you read the config rather than later is because you want to return errors as early as possible. That's fine. But in that case, I would actually cache that information. First of all, I wouldn't have it part of validate settings. I would validate settings first, and then I would have another function called cache files or something like that that loads these images, loads these files, and caches them in the Imager struct. So here we'll have, within this struct, we have some sort of like image cache. And it's just something like this, right? And then you could load that and store it in the cache. Then you have this imager that's reusable. So you could load the imager once when the server starts, for example, and have it sitting there with all those files loaded and validated. So if you have an error, you return that immediately, on the server startup rather than on per request. And then you have those files already loaded there, and you could reuse the same cached image stuff in memory for every request. So if you're getting 10,000 board requests per minute, you don't have to open that file, re-parse the image, etc. every time. So assuming that the reason for putting the validation of the files here was to have early error detection, that's a valid reason, especially for something that might run in a server. But I would do it a little bit differently. So I hope that all makes sense. I kind of breezed through that. If you have questions about that, leave a comment below. I'm happy to elaborate on that more. Maybe I could write a blog post about some of that if that's helpful. So in summary, 3 big things that I would recommend changing on this project. The first is don't hardcode paths in the configuration file or in the tests, because that's going to make it impossible or incredibly difficult to use. Second, get rid of the global state for the settings. Make that a part of the Imager struct. And third, separate file validation from config validation and potentially cache those files if you expect the Imager to be reused for multiple rendering. If you would like to have your code reviewed, contact me. You can find my details over at boldlygo.tech. My email is there. My social media accounts are there. I also want to mention that I have some spots open in the first quarter of 2024 for private mentors. I'm doing private Go mentoring. I have a couple different mentees I'm helping already. So if you would like this sort of feedback on your personal projects, maybe it's for work with code you can't share publicly, or you just have questions and you would like somebody you can bounce ideas off of and get feedback, I could be that guy. Head over to boldlygo.tech/mentoring to see all the details about my private Go mentoring plans, which I offer. We have 60-minute calls every month or twice a month, depending on the plan you choose, and unlimited chat over Slack or email to talk about your Go code and how you can improve your Go skills and your Go career. So I'd love to hear from you if that sounds interesting to you. In any case, be sure to hit that like button if you learned something today, and if you're new here, hit subscribe, and I'll see you again in a new video. Until then, make it go.